Welcome to episode 18 of the Macias Show. Happy Memorial Day. It's kind of an interesting day. I don't really consider, Happy Memorial Day to be the most appropriate statement. While many people are going to enjoy tubing on the river on my way to my office today to record this, I just ran into a couple people heading to the river here in New Braunfels and enjoying the day vacation. I think it's important, a couple important things to remember on Memorial Day. One, it's not Veterans Day, right? I do think that we sometimes confuse the two. A lot of people will see veterans and wish them a happy Memorial Day, and the reality is that this is a time for us to soberingly remember the fact that there are men and women in the armed forces that have given their lives, have literally given everything they have in order to preserve some amount of liberty, the amount of liberty and freedom that we enjoy today. It's something that makes America unique. It's something that makes us grateful for the generations that come before us and the generations currently serving. So have a blessed Memorial Day. And remember and appreciate sacrifices that other people have made so that we can be here discussing the issues of politics and policy and culture and things of that nature. Guys, today is the last day of the legislative session, sine die. It's a good thing in that legislators, if they're not in Austin, aren't messing up your lives. It's an unfortunate thing because there's just a ton of conservative policy that was left on the table. I want to quickly overview Senate Bill 2, HB 3, HB 1, just to give you an idea. I normally record this podcast on a Friday, and I delayed it till Monday. I'm actually recording on the day that we're releasing this just because there were so many details that had still yet to come out regarding the final pieces of the package of major legislation that would pass this session and that would culminate in the passage of our budget. I want to overview some of those things. I'll be honest, there's still a lot of details that are unknown regarding the specifics of the budget. Over the next couple weeks, I do hope to be able to break the budget down for you and explain more thoroughly the concerns of the fiscal irresponsibility that's being practiced within our budgeting. At the end of the day, the appropriators had a lot of different things they wanted to spend their money on, and they did. Unfortunately, it meant that a significant amount more significant relief was not able to be delivered to Texans. And it also is banking on a generous revenue estimate. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. But let me tell you the good things that have transpired. So Senate Bill 2 passed. It has a 3.5% cap on counties and cities, and that will start in the year of 2020. That is a win for taxpayers. We should be grateful to Representative Burrows, to Senator Paul Bettencourt, and many other Republicans who pushed that. Unfortunately, they kept what is called a de minimis rate in that bill. And so if you find yourself in a small city, in even a mid-sized city, to be honest, you're significantly negatively affected, meaning that your city will have the ability to raise your taxes, and a very small rural county will have the ability to raise your taxes, 15, 20, 25% without a voice of the people. They put a trigger in there that says if they raise it above 8%, you can go around and petition all your neighbors to then put it on the ballot. I don't understand why it would not have been appropriate just to have an automatic trigger at 8%, which again is a significant increase. Most of you are not seeing an income increase of 8%. So for rural Texans, for mid-cities Texans, unfortunately, you were not represented well in Senate Bill 2. But for a lot of Texans, in fact, one would say the vast majority of Texans who live in the larger counties, you are significantly protected. There are also ballot transparency measures, and there are some other accountability measures within Senate Bill 2 that are very powerful. Each and every one of you is going to be mailed a bill, and in your property tax bill, it will say, this is your property tax if each of these governing bodies decide to tax you more, if your taxes are going to go up. And this is the date at which they will decide to raise your taxes or keep your taxes the same. And so it gives a lot more accountability where the average property taxpayer will know just when the individual votes are taking place that raise their property taxes. And we should be very grateful to the Republican legislature for delivering on that. House Bill 3 is the school finance reform measure. It does some great things when it comes to increasing the state's share of public education funding. We probably should have a complete episode dedicated to public school finance. I'm sure we'll get all of about 10 of you to actually listen to that because it will be a very boring, in-depth, policy wonkish conversation. But It's important to understand that public education is the state's responsibility and that it is important for the state to cover a large share of that within its tax revenue. And so House Bill 3 moves into a more equitable, not only share from a state to local side, but also just from reducing recapture. And so for you who live in property-rich school districts, your taxes might decrease even more than the average Texans. And they also included $5 billion of property tax relief. It's important to note here that Representative Kyle Biederman, Representative Tony Tinderholt, I know Jonathan Stickland, and Paul Betancourt, I believe were the only legislators to really go out very publicly and say, we need at least $5 billion in property tax relief. And that probably gets into some of what the legislative session was like, but there was a real hesitancy to lawmakers to publicly ask for good public policy this last legislative session. And it was done in the name of being able to keep a seat at the table. It should always be noted that we should be concerned if somebody believes that in order to keep a seat at the table, whatever table that is, they need to not publicly support good public policy. And so our lawmakers must continue to stand up and actually make public calls, and often setting that public standard is what leads to a better result. We've seen that for sessions past, and it will be true going into next legislative session as well. If we don't have lawmakers that are willing to publicly come out and lay out a more aggressive public policy conservative agenda, then it's going to be difficult to get there. Senate Bill 2 and HB 3 culminate in the budget, House Bill 1. And I'm not going to go into too many details. I will tell you this, the budget grew significantly. And that's undeniable, whether it's, more established media sources, your more traditional media outlets, or conservative groups. They've all said that this budget grew significantly. And even when you take out the Hurricane Harvey portions of the budget, which are kind of seen as more one-time expenses that aren't traditionally in our budget, it still grew significantly. And so that is just an unfortunate reality that government grew a lot this session, and it will continue to grow significantly if we don't draw a line in the sand and say that Texas has got to start acting a little differently. This is also based on a very generous revenue estimate from our comptroller, Glenn Hager. And so recognize the fact that it only is growing this much if we end up bringing in this much tax revenue. Unfortunately, if we don't, we will end up coming back next session and being in a hole. We will end up coming back with a budget shortfall. We will have to take even more money from our savings account, of which they've already taken $6.5 billion from the savings account. So we'll have under $10 billion, and we will potentially have to spend billions more to shore up anything if the economy does not perform as strong as the comptroller would like it to. Hopefully the economy performs even better. We're able to come in with a surplus. Unfortunately, the lawmakers have shown that when they have a surplus, they look at growing government a lot with that surplus and then giving a little bit back to taxpayers in the form of tax relief. The legislation and the legislative session comes to a close. I want to also recognize a couple things that conservatives are very concerned about. At the end of the day, Texas started out this session as the 13th most pro-life state. Okay, for some people that's okay. For some people that's an accomplishment. For some people they see that as a failure. I will tell you this, we won't know exactly where we are in the rankings until next January 22nd when those rankings are redone. But I can tell you this, we're going to fall. We might fall significantly. We might fall to 18th, 19th, 20th, into the 20s. It would not surprise me at all if Texas were to lose 7, 8, 9 spots. And that is because while other states who were less pro-life than us have far surpassed us in their policy, just this year, Texas basically decided to take a break from that issue. We passed some very small, minute changes in the law that make some slight changes, but don't actually try to save more lives. And when it comes to the abortion issue, saving more lives is a priority. Also, when it comes to guns, again, going back to the fact that you can walk to the Canadian border from the Texas border under states that have constitutional carry laws. And yet in Texas, we have found it nearly impossible to even have a discussion around permitless carry. In fact, we almost didn't pass a bill that simply said that you can have permitless carry, which is in 31 other states, during a time of a natural disaster like Hurricane Harvey, where you can have the ability to defend yourself in a time where law enforcement is not as prevalent, is not as available as it would be otherwise. And even that barely passed the state Senate because Senator Joan Huffman did everything she could to try to kill it. So we have a sobering reality that lawmakers in Texas, Republican lawmakers in Texas, really don't support your Second Amendment to the extent that most Republicans across the rest of the nation do. And it's something that Texas has to get a hold of. And at the end of the day, also, when it just comes to reining in the size and scope of government, we didn't see a ton of wins this session. I am going to go, I'll tell you this is not an all negative podcast. One of the things I'm going to be working on during the summer is I'm going to do a good, a bad, and the ugly of the legislative session. So I'm going to go through an episode of just talking to you about the good. And I do think there is quite a bit to point to. And I do think that many of you will appreciate that episode because you will hear some really good, strong policies that were just common sense that some lawmakers had worked for years to do that we were able to get across the finish line. Last week, I talked to you about taxpayer-funded lobbying. Just to give you a quick update, for those of you who don't know, that policy died on the House floor. There were a couple dozen Republican lawmakers that teamed up with the Democrats to kill that policy. 91% of Texans think we should ban taxpayer-funded lobbying, lobbyists who are paid by taxpayers in order to come down and advocate for higher taxes. It's absolutely insane. That policy died, and those Republican lawmakers must be held accountable during the upcoming election season. In closing, there was an interesting conversation had about a week ago between Representative Jeff Leach, Representative Springer, and Mary Gonzalez. And I might try to pull a clip from that conversation and publish it on my Facebook page so y'all can see what I'm talking about. But I thought this was an example of just kind of how out of touch maybe some in the Republican caucus are right now as to what this legislative session was like. Evan Smith asked them, what do you think about the lack of conservative policy this session, right? We didn't we didn't pass any election reform, and we know that's desperately needed. We didn't really address strong pro-life issues. We did not touch the gun issue. Many of the social issues we stayed away from. Taxpayer-funded lobbying died in the House. This was not a significantly conservative session when it comes to comparisons to past legislative sessions. And Jeff Leach and Drew Springer both tried to kind of defend this is a conservative session. It is a session that conservatives can be proud of, and tried to, in a sense, communicate this mantra that conservatives should be looking at this session and very grateful for all that Republicans were able to give them. And then Mary Gonzalez had a time to comment. And, she basically made this statement. She said, if we had tried to have a conservative session like we've had in the past with the immigration issue, like we've had in the past on guns and abortion and all these things, she said it would have broken the House. And here's the reality, that Mary Gonzalez might be the only honest person when it comes to her perspective on this legislative session from a conservative perspective. She basically said, we made a calculus that if we addressed any of these issues that were found in the Republican platform, it would break the House. It would break the relationships in the House. And I can tell you this, that we have a lot to reflect on when it comes to the end of the legislative session. But if the Democrats are saying that we did not address Republican issues due to the relationship strain it would have put on the Texas House of Representatives, we need to acknowledge the fact that that was the decision made. And that when the Dallas Morning News and the Austin American Statesman and the Texas Scorecard and all of these publications are saying the same thing when it comes to conservative policies, then maybe there is something accurate about the avoidance of conservative policies this session. And maybe Republican lawmakers need to be a little more honest about that. I think politicians are going to return home and try to say that we had an awesome Super Bowl-esque session. But honest public servants are going to return home and tell Texas that we left a lot of conservative reforms on the table. And there's a lot of work to do. And they're going to be honest with their own voters about what needs to be done in order to give them the ability to pass more conservative policies coming in next session. If we are not honest looking back about how much conservative policy died this session and the lack of conservative policy that was even discussed this session, I think we will have a hard time not simply coming back in 2 years and repeating the same situation again. With that, guys, I am going to go straight to an ad from our sponsor, and then you are going to get a quick update from Raz on one key federal issue, and then I hope you have a blessed Memorial Day. Thank you for listening. Please consider subscribing. Please consider sharing this with your friends and family. God bless.